The signal came through at midnight, cutting through the silence of Frontier Station Orion like a blade through soft fabric. And Lisa Warren nearly spilled her coffee when she saw the origin coordinates on her screen. She checked the data 3 times because she could not believe what she was seeing. And each time, the result was the same, which made her hand shake as she reached for the emergency come button. "Commander Brooks, you need to come to the bridge right now," she said into the speaker, her voice trembling in a way that made even the night shift crew look up from their stations. Kevin Brooks arrived within minutes, his gray hair still messy from sleep and his uniform jacket hanging open. But his eyes were sharp and alert as they always were during a crisis. "What do we have, Warren?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. Consolisa pointed at the screen, where the transmission data glowed in soft blue light. And she watched his face change from tired annoyance to complete shock as he read the source identification. "That cannot be right," he whispered, leaning closer to the display. But it was right. And they both knew it because the authentication codes matched perfectly with the database records that every station commander memorized during their first week of training. The Crethani were calling in all of recorded galactic history. The Crethani had never once initiated peaceful contact with another species, and the thought of them reaching out now sent chills down the spines of everyone present. They were apex predators from Crethus Prime, a death world so harsh that evolution had crafted them into perfect killing machines, standing 7 feet tall with iridescent scales that could deflect most weapons and claws that could tear through starship hulls. Diplomatic missions from various species had attempted to establish relations with them over the past century, and all 12 had ended with the diplomats being eaten alive while their ships burned in orbit. The Crethani did not negotiate, did not trade, did not speak with prey, and to them, every other species in the galaxy was exactly that. Praise. Why were they calling a human station? Commander Brooks ordered the message to be translated and played, and the entire bridge fell silent as a deep rumbling voice filled the air. "Humans of the station called Orion. This is Matriarch Vexstar of the colony vessel Crenshaw, and I speak to you now because my people face death, and you are our only hope." The voice paused, and when it continued, there was something in it that no one had ever heard from a Crethani before. Desperation. Solar flare struck our ship 4 cycles ago and destroyed our medical systems along with half our crew. And now a plague spreads among the adults that we cannot stop. But our cubs remain unaffected by this sickness. Another pause, longer this time, when the last adult dies. The cubs will follow, for they cannot care for themselves. And our rescue fleet will not arrive for 23 of your days. So I ask you now, humans, will you take our young and keep them safe until help arrives? The message ended, leaving behind a silence so heavy that it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Lisa Warren was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "They want us to babysit Crethani cubs?" "It appears so," Brooks replied, still staring at the screen, as if it might suddenly reveal this was all some strange joke within the hour. The entire station was awake, and the senior staff had gathered in the main conference room, where arguments flew back and forth like weapons fire. Some said it was obviously a trap, that the Crethani were luring humans in so they could capture the station and use it as a base for raids on human colonies. Others argued that no species would use their own children as bait, not even the Crethani, and that refusing to help dying cubs would haunt humanity's reputation forever. Daniel Harper, the station's xenobiologist, listened to the debate for nearly an hour before he finally stood up and raised his hand for silence. He was a tall man in his late 30s with kind brown eyes and a patient demeanor that had served him well during his years of studying alien life forms across dozen worlds. I have spent my entire career trying to understand species that are different from us, he said, his voice calm and steady. And everything I know tells me this is real. Because no predator would ever show weakness unless they had no other choice. Grace Mitchell, the veterinary specialist who worked alongside Daniel, nodded in agreement from her seat near the window. She was younger than Daniel by almost a decade, with short red hair and freckles that made her look even younger. But her expertise in alien biology was unmatched on the station. The Crethini have never asked anyone for anything, she added, standing to join Daniel. And the fact that they are asking us, a species they have hunted, means they must be truly desperate. Commander Brooks looked at the two scientists for a long moment, weighing their words against the risks. If we agree to this and something goes wrong, it could mean war with the most dangerous species in the galaxy, he said slowly. And if we refuse, Daniel replied, children will die, and we will have to live with knowing we could have saved them. The room fell silent again. And in that silence, a decision was made. Commander Brooks reached for his comm unit and opened a channel to the Crethini vessel, Matriarch Vexthar. This is Commander Kevin Brooks of Frontier Station Orion, and we accept your request. So bring your cubs to us and we will protect them as if they were our own. The response came quickly, and though the translator could not convey emotion perfectly, everyone who heard it could sense something profound in the ancient predator's voice. Then perhaps the stories we have heard about your kind are true after all. Human. And we thank you. Daniel and Grace exchanged a glance that held both fear and determination in equal measure. They had no idea what caring for Crethini cubs would require. But they knew one thing for certain. Those children would not die on their watch as the station prepared for an arrival that would change galactic history forever. Daniel stood at the observation window and watched the stars, wondering what tomorrow would bring and whether humanity was truly ready for what was coming. He did not have the answers yet, but he was determined to find them because that was what humans did when innocents needed help. They showed up. They figured it out, and they never gave up. The Crethini vessel emerged from the darkness of space like a wounded beast dragging itself toward shelter. And everyone watching from the observation deck felt their breath catch in their throats. The ship was massive, easily 5 times the size of the station, but great chunks of its hull had been torn away by the solar flare, leaving behind jagged wounds that still glowed with residual heat. Daniel stood at the front of the reception team, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. And beside him, Grace clutched a medical scanner with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts to stay calm. Commander Brooks had insisted that the reception team carry no weapons, as the Crethini had specifically requested this as a condition of docking. And now Daniel wondered if that had been wise. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and a wave of hot air washed over the waiting humans, carrying with it a scent like copper and burnt cinnamon that made several team members step back involuntarily. Then she appeared. Matriarch Vexthar stood in the doorway, and Daniel finally understood why the galaxy feared the Crethini so deeply. She towered over him by more than 2 feet, her body covered in scales that shifted between deep purple and midnight blue as they caught the light, and her eyes were vertical slits of burning gold that seemed to look straight through him into his very soul. Her claws were as long as his fingers and curved like scythes, clearly designed for tearing through flesh with terrible efficiency. And her mouth, when she opened it slightly, revealed rows of teeth that could crush bone without effort. This was a creature built for killing, perfected by millions of years of evolution on a world where only the deadliest survived. And she was standing close enough for Daniel to touch, but then he noticed something else. Something that changed everything. Clutching the matriarch's leg with tiny clawed hands was a small figure barely 3 feet tall, with wide, frightened eyes that held none of the predator's cold calculation. The cub pressed herself against her mother's leg and stared at Daniel with an expression he recognized immediately, because he had seen it many times before on the faces of scared children in hospitals and refugee camps across human space. It was fear, pure and simple. The universal look of a young creature who did not understand what was happening and wanted only to feel safe. "This is Zira," Vexstar said. Her voice a deep rumble that vibrated through Daniel's chest. "My daughter and the future of my bloodline, and I am placing her in your care." Daniel slowly knelt down so that he was at eye level with the small Crethany, moving carefully to avoid startling her. "Hello, Zira," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle and warm. "My name is Daniel, and I promise that no harm will come to you while you are with us." The cub tilted her head, studying him with those large golden eyes, and for a moment nothing happened. Then Vexstar spoke again, and her words carried a weight that made Daniel look up at her in surprise. "We have watched your species for many cycles, human, studying you from afar as we study all potential prey. But what we observed confused us greatly." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. Something that might have been wonder or perhaps confusion. "You fight wars with terrible ferocity, destroying enemies who threaten your territory. Yet when the war ends, you rebuild the worlds you have conquered and feed the people you have defeated." Grace stepped forward to stand beside Daniel, her fear momentarily forgotten as she listened to the predator speak. "We saw your soldiers adopt children from enemy species, raising them as their own despite the blood between your peoples. And we watched your healers treat wounded enemies with the same care they gave their own kin." Vexstar looked down at her daughter, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before. "We call it the guardian instinct. This strange drive that makes humans protect young that are not their own, young of species that have hurt them, young of their enemies." She reached down and gently lifted Zira's small hand, then placed it carefully into Daniel's open palm. The cub's scales were warm and smooth against his skin, and he could feel her tiny claws pressing lightly against his fingers as she gripped him with hesitant trust. "We do not have this instinct," Vexstar continued, "for on our world, only our own blood matters, and the young of enemies are threats to be destroyed before they can grow strong." She met Daniel's eyes, and he saw something there that shocked him more than anything else had that day. "Respect. But you humans are different. And though we cannot understand why you are this way, we have learned to recognize it. And that is why I trust you with my child when I would not trust any other species in the galaxy." Daniel stood slowly, still holding Zira's hand, and he felt the weight of this moment settling onto his shoulders. "We will not betray that trust," he said firmly. "I give you my word." Over the next hour, more cubs were brought across from the dying ship, 17 in total, ranging in age from what seemed like toddlers to young adolescents. Each one was scared, some hissing and snapping at the humans who approached, others simply huddling together in frightened silence. Grace immediately began scanning them, making notes about their vital signs and health conditions. While Daniel worked to keep them calm, he discovered quite by accident that humming seemed to soothe them, the low vibrations apparently similar to sounds their parents made. And soon he was humming old lullabies while helping the cubs settle into the temporary nursery. The station crew had hastily prepared. Vexstar watched everything through a video link from her ship, too weak from the plague to make another journey, but unwilling to look away from her daughter even for a moment. The long day finally wound toward evening, and the exhausted cubs began to fall asleep in their new beds. Daniel sat beside Zira and hummed softly until her eyes drifted closed. He looked at her small sleeping form, at the predator's claws and teeth that would one day make her a feared hunter. And he saw only a child who needed protection that was something he could give her, something any human would give without hesitation. And perhaps that was exactly what made humanity special in a galaxy full of predators and prey. The first week was chaos in the purest sense of the word, and Grace Mitchell slept no more than 3 hours each night as she worked to understand the biology of creatures that no human had ever studied up close. The Crethny cubs had dietary needs unlike anything in the station's databases, requiring a specific combination of proteins and minerals that Grace had to synthesize from scratch using equipment meant for completely different purposes. She made mistakes, plenty of them, but she learned from each one and kept pushing forward. By the third day, she had created a nutritional pace that the cubs actually seemed to enjoy. And watching them eat without fear for the first time made every sleepless hour worth it. Daniel, meanwhile, focused on the emotional needs of their young charges, spending hours in the nursery simply being present and allowing the cubs to grow accustomed to his scent and voice. The humming trick worked wonders, and soon other crew members were learning lullabies to help soothe the frightened children when Daniel could not be there. Zira had attached herself to Daniel almost completely, following him wherever he went and making distressed sounds whenever he left her sight for too long. He started carrying her on his hip the way he had seen parents carry human toddlers. And though her claws sometimes scratched him through his uniform, he never complained or pushed her away. On the 5th day, something wonderful happened. One of the younger cubs, a male named Threx, who had spent the first few days hiding in corners and refusing to interact with anyone, finally emerged from his shell. Crew member named Patricia Wells had brought some toys from the station's family quarters. Simple things like building blocks and softballs. Thinking the cubs might enjoy them, Threx spotted a bright blue ball and crept toward it with the careful stalking movements of a predator approaching prey. But when he pounced on it and the ball squeaked loudly, he jumped back in surprise. Then something amazing occurred. He made a sound that could only be described as laughter within minutes. All the cubs were chasing balls and knocking over block towers, their earlier fear forgotten in the joy of play. And the human crew members watching from the doorway found themselves smiling despite everything. News of the Crethny cubs spread quickly through the galactic communication networks, and reactions varied wildly from species to species. Ambassador Torvak of the Malari Confederacy demanded a private call with Commander Brooks, and his tentacled face was twisted with disbelief when the connection opened. "How did you accomplish this?" he asked, his translator rendering his words in a tone that mixed accusation with genuine confusion. "My people lost 200 diplomats trying to establish contact with the Crethny, and you simply offer to babysit their young, and suddenly they are willing to talk." Brooks kept his expression neutral as he replied, "We did not accomplish anything, Ambassador. We simply agreed to help children who were in danger." And the Crethny responded to that. Torvak's confusion only deepened. "But they are enemy young. They will grow up to become predators who might hunt your people. So why would you protect them instead of eliminating the threat while they are vulnerable?" The question hung in the air, and Brooks realized that Torvak genuinely could not understand the answer. "Because they are children," Brooks said slowly, "and children deserve protection regardless of what species they belong to, or what they might become when they grow up." Torvak stared at him for a long moment, then ended the call without another word. Meanwhile, on the dying Crethny vessel, Vexthar watched the nursery feeds with an intensity that her failing body could barely sustain. She saw Daniel teaching the older cubs a simple human game involving hiding objects and finding them, and she watched their excitement when they succeeded in locating the hidden treasures. She saw Grace singing softly to a sick cub while administering medicine, her voice gentle and soothing despite the cub's earlier attempts to bite her. Saw crew members bringing handmade blankets and stuffed toys that they had crafted during their off hours, gifts for children of a species that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. And she saw her daughter Zira sleeping peacefully in Daniel's arms while he read reports on a datapad, completely trusting that this human would keep her safe through the night. Vexthar did not understand these creatures. Not truly, but she understood one thing with perfect clarity. She had made the right choice on the 8th day. One of the other surviving adults on the Crethany ship, a hunter named Kresh, questioned her decision. "You have shown weakness to prey," he growled, his voice thick with the plague that was slowly killing him. "And when the cubs return, they will carry the stink of humans on their scales forever." Vexthar turned to face him, and though she could barely stand, her eyes still held the fire of a matriarch. "I have shown wisdom," she replied, "for I have found a species that will protect our young even when we cannot. And that is worth more than all the pride in the galaxy." Kresh had no response to that, and he died the following morning still trying to understand back on the station. The cubs were learning new things every day. Picking up human words and gestures with surprising speed, Jira could now say Daniel's name, though it came out as Daniel in her young voice. And she had learned to wave goodbye when he left the nursery. The older cubs had started helping the younger ones, mimicking the caretaking behavior they saw in the humans. And Grace noted in her research logs that this cooperative instinct had never been documented in Crethany before. Perhaps it had always been there, hidden beneath the layers of predator culture, waiting for someone to show them a different way. Perhaps that was what humans were truly good at, not conquering other species, but showing them possibilities they had never imagined. And as the days passed and the rescue fleet drew closer, everyone on the station began to realize that something historic was happening. The galaxy would never be the same after this. The disaster happened on the 12th day, and it nearly destroyed everything they had worked so hard to build. A young male cub named Threk, one of the oldest at roughly the equivalent of a human teenager, had been struggling to adapt more than the others. He was old enough to remember the hunting lessons his father had given him before the plague, old enough to feel the predator instincts that ran through his blood. And the confined spaces of the station made him restless in ways the younger cubs did not experience that night. While most of the station slept, Threk found a ventilation panel that had not been properly secured and squeezed. Through it into the maintenance tunnels, he wandered for hours, his hunting instincts guiding him through the maze of corridors, until he emerged in the reactor section where a maintenance worker named Chris Turner was performing routine checks alone. Chris never saw him coming. The attack was brutal and swift, driven by instincts that Threk could not control, and by the time security arrived, Chris was lying in a pool of his own blood with deep claw wounds across his chest and arms. Threk crouched over him, his scales raised in a threat display, his golden eyes wild with a mixture of fear and predator fury that made even the armed security officers hesitate to approach. Daniel arrived moments later, having been woken by the emergency alert, and what he saw made his heart sink into his stomach. Everything they had built, all the trust and goodwill and hope, could be destroyed by this single moment. "Everyone stay back," he ordered, his voice firm despite the terror he felt inside. "And lower your weapons now." The security officers looked at him like he had lost his mind, but something in his tone made them obey. Daniel walked slowly toward Threk, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate, humming softly the same lullaby he had used to calm the cubs on their first night. Threk display flickered, uncertainty replacing some of the wildness in his eyes. "I know you were scared," Daniel said quietly, "and I know this place feels wrong to you. But I need you to trust me now, because if you do not, very bad things will happen to you and to all the other cubs." Threk hissed, but he did not attack behind Daniel. Medics were rushing to help Chris, who was still breathing despite his terrible wounds, and the sound of their movement made Threk tense again. "Look at me," Daniel said firmly, drawing the young predator's attention back, "only at me, and listen to my voice." Minutes passed like hours as Daniel slowly, carefully talked Threk down from his panicked state. using every technique he had learned in his years of working with frightened alien creatures. Finally, Threk's scales lowered and his posture softened, and when Daniel extended his hand, the young Crethini took it and allowed himself to be led away. The aftermath was nearly as difficult as the incident itself. Word spread through the station like wildfire. And suddenly, the crew was divided between those who wanted to continue helping the cubs and those who demanded they be confined or sedated for everyone's safety. A heated meeting erupted in the conference room, with voices rising to shouts as fear and anger collided with compassion and commitment. Commander Brooks listened to both sides, his face unreadable, and when he finally spoke, his words cut through the noise like a blade. "We will hear from the victim before we make any decisions," he said, "because Chris Turner has the most right to speak on this matter." The room fell silent as a video connection opened to the medical bay, where Chris lay in a bed with bandages covering most of his upper body. He looked pale and tired, but his eyes were clear as he addressed his crewmates. "I know what some of you want," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "and I understand why you are afraid. Because I was afraid too when that cub attacked me." He paused, wincing slightly as pain shot through his wounds. "But I have been thinking about it all morning, and I keep coming back to the same question. What would I have done if I was a scared kid trapped in a strange place, surrounded by creatures that look like monsters?" Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. "That cub was not evil," Chris continued. "He was frightened and confused and acting on instincts he cannot control. And punishing him for that would be like punishing a human child for having a nightmare." He looked directly into the camera, and his next words carried a weight that silenced every objection. "I forgive him, and I ask all of you to do the same, because that is what humans do. And that is why those cubs were trusted to us in the first place." The meeting ended with no changes to the arrangement, and word of Chris's statement was transmitted to the Crethini vessel at the request of several crew members who thought the dying adults should know what had happened. At Vexstar watched the recording with the other surviving Crethini, and for the first time in her long life, she wept openly, not tears of sorrow or pain, but tears of something she had no word for in her language. Her people had hurt a human, had spilled his blood and nearly killed him, and his response was forgiveness. It made no sense according to everything she had been taught about prey species. Yet there it was, undeniable and profound. "Perhaps," she whispered to the silent room, "we have been the ones living in darkness all along." The remaining days before the rescue fleet arrived passed without further incident, and something had changed in the atmosphere of the station. The crew no longer saw the cubs as dangerous alien creatures to be handled with caution, but as children who needed guidance and patience and love. And the cubs, in turn, began to see the humans not as strange soft creatures to be feared, but as something new, something wonderful guardians. The Crethini rescue fleet emerged from hyperspace on the 23rd day, and the sight of it made every human on the station hold their breath. 12 warships, each one bristling with weapons that could reduce Frontier Station Orion to atoms in seconds, arranged themselves in a formation that spoke of absolute military precision. This was the fleet that had burned entire civilizations to ash, and now it hung in space just kilometers away from a station full of humans who had spent the past 3 weeks caring for their children. Commander Brooks stood on the bridge, watching the lead ship on the main display, and he wondered if this was the moment when everything went wrong. Then the communication channel opened, and a voice that somehow managed to sound even more powerful than Vex stars filled the room. "Frontier Station Orion. This is Fleet Admiral Korath of the Crethini Imperial Navy, requesting permission to dock and retrieve our young." Brooks let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Permission granted. Admiral, Docking Bay 4 is prepared for your arrival. An hour later." Daniel stood in that same docking bay with Grace at his side, and all 17 cubs gathered behind them. Cleaned and fed and dressed in the simple clothing the station crew had made for them, Zira held his hand tightly, her small claws digging into his palm. And he could feel her trembling as the airlock opened. Admiral Korath was even more imposing than Vexthar had been. A massive wall of muscle and scales, and barely contained violence that made every human instinct scream to run behind him, came a procession of Krathani warriors, each one armed and armored, their golden eyes scanning the docking bay for threats. Korath stopped in front of Daniel and looked down at him with an expression that was impossible to read. "You are the one called Daniel Harper," he said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "The one who has cared for our matriarch's daughter." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Korath's gaze shifted to the cubs, and something changed in his posture. A subtle softening that the humans might not have noticed if they had not spent weeks learning to read Krathani body language. The cubs were different. They stood calmly instead of cowering, some of them even smiling in the way humans had taught them. And when one of the younger ones waved at the Admiral with a cheerful gesture clearly copied from the station crew, Korath's eyes widened with unmistakable surprise. "They are not afraid," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "They have learned that there is nothing to fear from those who wish them well," Daniel replied. Finding his voice at last, Korath studied him for a long moment, then did something that made every warrior behind him gasp in shock. He lowered his head in a gesture of respect. "I came here expecting to find cubs traumatized by captivity among aliens," he said. "Children who would need cycles of healing before they could function normally again." He raised his head and looked at the cubs once more, watching as Zira pressed herself against Daniel's leg in a gesture of complete trust. "Instead, I find young who have been loved and taught and protected, who have learned things that our people have never known, and who will carry those lessons back to our worlds." Grace stepped forward, holding out a datapad containing all her research on Krathani biology and health. "We documented everything we learned," she said, "so that you can take better care of them when they return home." Korath accepted the device with surprising gentleness, then passed it to one of his officers without looking away from Grace. "The Krathani Empire has spent 10,000 years believing that kindness is weakness," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with great care. "That compassion invites exploitation, and that the only way to survive is to be the most dangerous creature in any room." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an emotion that Daniel had never expected to hear from an apex predator: humility. "You humans have proven us wrong, for you possess the capacity for terrible violence. We have studied your wars and know what you are capable of. Yet you chose gentleness toward vulnerable young who were not your own." He straightened to his full height, and his next words were spoken loudly enough for everyone in the docking bay to hear. "This is not weakness. It is a strength that we do not possess, and we wish to learn it from you." Commander Brooks stepped forward, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with hope. "What exactly are you proposing, Admiral?" Korath reached into his armor and withdrew a small crystalline object that pulsed with inner light. "This is a bonding crystal, given only to those the Krathani consider equals, and I offer it now to humanity as a symbol of alliance and a promise of peace." He placed the crystal in Brooks's hands. "We will open our borders to your traders and your scholars. We will share our knowledge of the stars with your explorers, and in return, we ask only that you continue to teach us what you have taught our cubs." It was the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in centuries, achieved not through negotiations or treaties, but through something far simpler: an agreement to help children in need. The cubs were loaded onto Krathani shuttles over the next few hours, each one saying goodbye to the humans who had cared for them. And some of those farewells were harder than anyone had expected when Zira's turn came. She refused to let go of Daniel's hand. "Come with me," she said in the broken human words she had learned, her golden eyes pleading. "Please, Danielle." Daniel knelt down to her level, his heart aching in ways he had not known were possible. "I cannot come with you, little one," he said gently, "but I promise that I will visit you someday, and until then, you must be brave and remember everything you learned here." Zira threw her small arms around his neck and held on tightly, and Daniel hugged her back. This predator's child, who had somehow become precious to him. "I will remember," she whispered when she finally let go and walked toward the shuttle. She looked back only once, and in that moment, Daniel saw not a future hunter or a feared predator, but simply a child who had been loved as the Crethany fleet departed. Grace came to stand beside Daniel at the observation window. "Do you think it will last?" she asked quietly, watching the ships grow smaller against the stars. The Alliance. Daniel thought about the question for a long time. Remembering everything that had happened over the past weeks, he thought about Vexthar's desperation and trust, about Karth's humility and respect, about Chris Turner's forgiveness and the way the cubs had learned to laugh and play. He thought about Zira's small hand in his, and the hope he had seen in her predator's eyes. "Yes," he said finally. "I think it will last, because it was not built on politics or profit or power, but on something real." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Daniel smiled, still watching the last flickers of the Crethany ships as they prepared to jump into hyperspace. "A simple truth that crosses every boundary in the universe," he said. "Children deserve to be protected, and humans will always answer that call." The ships vanished into the darkness between stars, carrying with them the seeds of a new era, and somewhere in that vast, cold emptiness, a young Crethany pressed her face against a window and watched the human station grow smaller. Already counting the days until she could see Danielle again, the galaxy had changed that day. Not through conquest or war, but through an act of simple kindness, and that, perhaps, was the most human thing of all.